各位观众，大家好，欢迎收看华尔街电视。还没订阅我们频道的观众，记得先按下下方的订阅按钮，还有按钮旁边的小铃铛，才能第一时间收到我们的最新信息。今天的节目，我们很荣幸邀请到澳洲悉尼大学副教授、社会学家巴伯尼斯，来跟我们谈谈他的新书《美国的天下：中国资金、美国权力和历史的终结》（American 天下 Chinese Money, American Power, and the End of History）。So, first, could you tell us what kind of sources did you draw on to write this book?
Well, the inspiration for American Tianxia was to take Chinese international relations theory and apply it to the American world. Chinese international relations theory is really fascinating because it draws on, 2,000 years of Chinese history, which has very different examples from the ones we see coming from Western history. So Chinese international relations theory starts with the 3,000 years ago in the Zhou dynasty, and then works its way through certainly the Ming and the Qing to the current day. And one of the big inspirations for the American Tianxia book was the Chinese theorist Zhao Tingyang. Professor Zhao had a book in the mid-2000s called the Tianxia System, and he applied the classical Zhou dynasty but also Ming Dynasty idea of the Chinese Tianxia to the world he would like to see in the future. And in many ways, my own book, American Tianxia, is an answer to that. It says that the new Tianxia already exists, but it's not a Chinese-led Tianxia, it's an American-led Tianxia.
Yeah, the important view in your book is, although China is emerging as a global power, China will not overtake the United States. So could you talk about the reason why do you think the U.S. will remain as a leading power?
Well, I think it's very important to make a distinction between China, the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese people as a much bigger group, which includes Chinese overseas, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Singapore, and especially in California and the United States. Certainly, the Chinese people are becoming wealthier, better educated, more influential, more powerful. They're contributing to the world in a way that maybe they didn't 100 years ago. But that's not the same as the People's Republic of China. China itself has grown rapidly over the past 40 years and has become a much more developed country than it was 40 years ago. But the best Chinese scholars and the best Chinese engineers and the most educated Chinese people very often seek to participate in global networks that are much bigger than China itself. And once they participate in global networks, they're really fundamentally participating in American networks. Silicon Valley is full of Chinese people. The New York financial world is full of Chinese people, but they're not contributing to the power or growth of China. They're actually contributing to the stability of this global American system of which they're a part.
So we often heard that the Chinese leaders are thinking of displacing the United States. So are Chinese leaders really serious about displacing the United States as the #1 power in Asia and in the world?
I think that Chinese leaders like Xi Jinping are living in a previous century. If you think about the 19th or the 20th century, when the people of a country became strong, the country became strong. So if you imagine Xi Jinping's Chinese dream, he says that by becoming educated and wealthy, the Chinese people will lead to a more powerful China. And I think there's a big mistake there. In the 19th or 20th century, the leading people of a country contributed to that country. Xi Jinping went to Tsinghua University. But today, that's just not true. Xi Jinping may have gone to Tsinghua University, but his daughter went to Harvard.
Yeah.
right? And I think that encapsulates everything right there. China is growing. China has become much more developed than it was. But as China develops, that opens up the borders or opens the boundaries for Chinese people to participate in these larger global networks. And that's very different from previous rising powers. When Germany was a rising power, the best educated and the most intelligent and the most entrepreneurial Germans did not go to England or the United States. They stayed in Germany and contributed to the development of Germany. The same thing when Japan was a rising power in Asia. The most industrious people in Japan contributed to the growth of Japan. And as a result, Germany, the country, and Japan, the country, challenged the United States for global power. But China, the country, cannot challenge the United States for global power when the most entrepreneurial, most hardworking, most ambitious Chinese people actually seek to join that larger American system. And I think that that's the secret of the American Tianxia. No matter how wealthy China gets, Chinese people will be participating in these larger global networks. Now, I want to make clear, China is not going to overtake the United States in GDP or GDP per capita. I think those growth projections are really very flawed. But the whole American Tianxia argument does not depend on growth in China or growth in America or numbers of aircraft carriers or military spending. It's really all about people. And as people make choices to participate in these global American networks, they reinforce American power structures in a way that has never happened previously in world history.
So what is special about the U.S. system? Like, why is the world system centered on the U.S. system for so long?
I think the very special thing about the American system is its individualism. Really, if you think about it, the United States is the only country that was founded on the very principle of individualism. The United States Declaration of Independence, all the way back in 1776, said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, all people, are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The idea that an individual exists to pursue his or her own happiness, not to develop the family's wealth, not to serve the country. In fact, the U.S. Declaration of Independence says countries are created to serve the rights of individuals. Right? So the U.S. is the only country that was born with the idea that the country exists for the people. The people don't exist for the country. And because of that, when people want to be true individuals in the world, they're inevitably drawn to America. Sometimes they're drawn literally. They move to America. But even if they don't move to America, they come to think like Americans. Think of Chinese universities. All of them are implementing North American-style curricula. They're all hiring English-speaking academics. They all want professors who've been educated at the top American universities. China itself is developing in its own people the idea of American individualism. Even though on an official level, China claims to be opposing the United States. I think that this movement of people and this change in people's minds is something that's really irreversible, and it's distinctly American. You can be a patriotic German who's German, or a patriotic Japanese who's Japanese, or a patriotic Chinese who's Chinese. But once you become a global individual, once you become somebody who wants the very best for yourself and your family and your children, well, where do you want your children to go to school? Not a Japanese or a German or a Chinese university. You want them to go to Harvard, Yale, or Stanford. Where do you want your children to work? Not at a Japanese or a German or a Chinese company. You want them to work at Google or Facebook. And this is really what is driving the dominance of American ways of thinking and of the United States itself. That all of these people in the world contribute to American power by wanting to be part of the American system.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that the Ming Dynasty was the center of East Asia, and now the world is an American 天下. So could you talk about the similarities and the differences between these two tributary systems?
I think they're very similar systems, but also very different. They're very similar because in Ming East Asia, the period before 1644, the old pre-modern East Asia, in Ming East Asia, China was the undisputed center of civilization, the undisputed center of learning. Countries all around China, Vietnam and Korea and Japan, tried to attract Chinese scholars to come teach their own people and teach their own scholars. They all adopted the Chinese calendar, Chinese forms of writing. They looked up to the Confucian classics as being not just the great classics of China, but the great classics of civilization. And the whole idea of a tianxia is that it's not just a physical world. It's a physical world with an ideological component, with a way of thinking that is shared across the entire world. Well, before 1640, all of East Asia may not have been ruled by China, but all of it accepted the basic ideas that emanated from China. I think in the same way today, the world accepts the basic ideas that emanate from the United States. They may disagree with the United States. They may want to go to war with the United States. But they still accept the basic ideas of people pursuing their own individual fulfillment that emanated from the United States. And the big difference between the old Ming tianxia and today's American tianxia is that the Ming tianxia was exclusive. Okay? China did not permit people to go overseas. If you were Chinese and you left China, you were breaking the law, and you could be killed trying to escape the country. Similarly, people were not allowed to come to China. Right? It was a very exclusionary view of civilization. The difference with the American tianxia is that the American tianxia is a very inclusive view of civilization. Anybody in the world can become American. And even if you don't literally become American, even if you don't get a blue passport and become a US citizen, you can still come to embrace American ideas, even in your own country. And I think all over the world, people want American-style freedoms in their own countries. And so the American tianxia is not defensive like the Chinese tianxia, the Ming Chinese tianxia. It is in fact very expansionary. It's the same basic concept, same structural features, but instead of being very limited, it's very open. And that's why I think it's ultimately much more solid.
Yeah, but now the Trump administration is committed to a foreign policy focused on American first. So how will this affect the U.S. global power?
I think we have to think in terms of decades and centuries, not in terms of months and years. Trump's America First policies are on the surface very exclusionary. Trump is not very welcoming to foreigners, but that's right now. In 5 years, in 10 years, there'll be a different president, there will be a different policy. I think the point is that even with Trump as president, people all over the world still want to go to Harvard or Stanford University, they still want to work for Google or Facebook, and they still want to get an American passport. Now, if I were in the Trump administration, I would tell Donald Trump the whole strength of America is based on its inclusiveness. I would be welcoming immigrants. I would especially want to welcome Chinese immigrants, Chinese immigrants with investor visas or Chinese coming to have children in the United States. I think that makes America much stronger. In fact, I would support a law that says that anyone who comes to get a university degree in the United States should get permanent residence. Let them stay after they finish the degrees. So I think Trump could adopt policies that would strengthen the American appeal even more. But I don't think 4 or even 8 years of Trump will substantially diminish the appeal of the United States. Investors and students still want to come to the United States, Trump or no Trump. It really doesn't make a difference.
And what do you think the policies and actions should the U.S. avoid in dealing with the rise of China?
I think there's no point picking a fight with China. And here I think the Trump administration has actually done a reasonably good job. One of Trump's first actions was to invite Xi Jinping to his Mar-a-Lago retreat to try to paper over the campaign rhetoric. Campaign rhetoric in the U.S. is always anti-China, but as soon as Trump was in office, he tried to make friends with China. And I think that's the right approach. The best thing for the U.S. to do vis-a-vis China is to be basically friendly, open, supportive, not to give in to China. I don't think the United States should support Chinese expansionism. For instance, in the South China Sea, China has illegally seized and built bases on islands that it does not legally control, and the United States should challenge that, but challenge that in a peaceful, direct way, announcing that it will send ships on freedom of navigation operations and then conducting those operations in full view, in open. That's not the sort of behavior that will lead to conflict. I think the United States should not in any way seek conflict with China. It should simply assert its presence and assert the rights of international law. And I think that's really sufficient to keep the peace in East Asia.
So my next question, maybe you mentioned a little bit before. You think that an American-led world system has ended the nation state and desegregated the world into individuals, resulting in a more peaceful, open, and orderly world. So could you talk more about why do you think so?
Well, the state is not going anywhere. There are some 200 countries in the world, and they all have their own independent states, and that's there, and that's going to continue to be there. But we routinely call them the nation state, and I think that's what's changing. People around the world are less and less nationalist. Now, there has been a resurgence in rhetoric about nationalism, but if you look at the places where there's been a rhetoric of nationalism, those are all places where people are leaving the country in enormous numbers. I mean, places like Hungary and Poland, where there might be governments that talk about nationalism, but where literally millions of their citizens live in other countries. Right? So people are no longer as attached to the idea of a nation. And I think that's inevitable. Once they become individuals, they're no longer Hungarians and Poles and even Chinese, or they become citizens of the world. And when people become citizens of the world, they fundamentally become citizens of the American world. Now, I think that makes the world a much more peaceful place. If you look at the wars of the 20th century and the 19th century, there were continuous wars of countries taking territory from other countries, invasions and seizures of land, the Japanese invasion of China and all of the horrors that went with that. Look at today's world. Today's world, there's only been one military change of border in the last 20 or 30 years, and that's the Russian seizure of Crimea. And that's the only one. Other than that, the rest of the world's borders have been stable. Why? Because today, if Japan wants to exploit Chinese labor in its auto factories, it doesn't have to invade Manchuria. It can simply invest in the Dongbei region. And that investment is very welcome. People in China, whatever the rhetoric might be, the fact is that people in China welcome Japanese investment in auto plants in China, right? We no longer have the national borders that a Japanese car has to be made in Japan and a Chinese car has to be made in China. Instead, we have much less of a national distinction and much more of an individual or a corporate identity. Toyota operates in China. Japan doesn't operate in China. Toyota, right? And that porousness of borders, the separation of what used to be nation states into states composed of individuals and companies and organizations and NGOs and universities has made the world a much more peaceful place. You don't have to invade England to go to Oxford. You can just apply to Oxford and you'll likely get in.
Yes. Yeah. So I know that you don't think China will one day overtake the US, but is there any possibility that, like, under what circumstances would China overtake the US?
I think it's really inconceivable in this century. I think people are always skeptical of predictions, and maybe they should be. But some predictions can be made over the right time frame. If you ask me to predict China's economy next year, I'll tell you I don't know what growth rate China will have next year. But if you ask me for China's growth rate over the next 40 or 80 years, I can actually have a lot of confidence based on social science models of growth rates. We're pretty confident that as China has developed, its growth rate has slowed down. And you can use the example of South Korea. It took about 40 years for South Korea to go from having 1/30th of US GDP per capita to having 1/3. It took another 40 years for South Korea to go from 1/3 to 1/2. Right? So as you get richer, growth gets much, much more difficult. Now, on top of that, not only is China's growth slowing, but China's population is going to begin to drop. So usually when people say China is going to be the biggest economy in the world, they say, well, if China's economy grows at all, multiply that by 1.4 billion people, and it's going to be the biggest economy in the world. But China's population is right now nearing its maximum. In fact, China's working age population has already reached its maximum about 2 years ago. China's population is increasingly elderly, and because of the low fertility rates in China, China's population is expected to start falling in the early 2020s, by 2025. By the end of the century, by the year 2100, China is likely to have only 700 million people. Now that's hard to imagine. 700 million people. That's hard to imagine that China's population will fall by 1/2 by the end of the century. But if you start thinking about it, if 2 people have 1 child, well, arithmetically, it's obvious that over the course of 40, 50, 60, 80 years, the population is going to start falling. China's fertility rate has declined along with the rest of East Asia. It's now around 1.3 children per mother. And with that kind of fertility rate, China's population will start dropping very rapidly by mid-century. So even if China's growth in GDP per capita continues, its total GDP will start to fall. Now, contrast that with the United States. The United States has had slow, consistent growth of about 1.9% per year over the last 220 years. And if you disaggregate that, it's about 1.9% per year GDP per capita growth, and then there's an additional 0.2% per year population growth. Now, that US population growth is because people have consistently moved to America every year for the last 200 years, and we have every reason to expect that to continue. As a result, by the end of the century, the United States is likely to have 400 million people. North America as a whole is likely to have 600 or 650 million people. It may be hard to imagine today, but by the end of the century, North America and China will be roughly similar in total population, and North America will have a much bigger economy.
Yeah, my last question is, what new knowledge do you hope readers will come away with after they've finished the book?
I'm a social scientist. I'm not someone who writes about, wars or conflicts or who tries to make predictions to grab attention. What I want to do is educate people. And what I'd like people to learn from the book is the idea that these big trends in history operate very slowly, but inexorably. These big trends, are going year by year by year over a very long term. For example, population decline in China is not a problem for this year or next year. It's a problem for the next 80 years. Similarly, the openness of the American system is not going to change because Donald Trump is president or somebody else is president. The system has been open and attracting people since before the United States existed, for 300 years or so. The American colonies and later the United States have been attracting immigrants and attracting people to their ideals. That's not going to change. Now, I can't make predictions after the year 2100, but I think that if you look at least at the next few generations, it's very clear that America is a place that attracts people, that American ideals of freedom attract people, that there will be immigration to the US, that China will be a place that people want to leave, not a place that people want to go to, and that Chinese society does not welcome people in the way that US society does. These big trends are not things that are going to change year by year. And I'd really like people to take away a sense that the old Chinese tianxia of the Ming Dynasty lasted for 300 or 400 years. This new American tianxia is not something I'm writing about for 2017 or 2018 or 2019. It's something I'm writing about for 1 century and maybe for 3 or 4 centuries.
今天的采访就到这边，谢谢巴伯尼斯教授的参与，也谢谢广大网友的收看。最后，请帮我们将视频分享出去或按赞，我们下回见。